and and as director of the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens, I have the pleasure of welcoming you this evening, or whatever time of day it is in your time zone, to our Institute's public lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Robert Jones. Our speaker received his tertiary education at East Tennessee State University and Austin Peay State University, Clarksville in the US, and then at the University of Newcastle, Australia, where he received his doctoral degree. Dr. Jones is a man with a very broad spectrum of interests that range from military history through to wildlife preservation and onto fiction writing. This evening, he will focus on the first of these, specifically as they pertain to antiquity. In 2018, with a permit issued by our institute, he, alongside Emeritus Professor David Kennedy of the University of Western Australia and representatives of the ephorias of West Attica and Boeotia, undertook a survey on the battlefield of Plataea. Of course, we all know the Battle of Plataea as a landmark event in Greek history, indeed as a turning point, one for which our knowledge, as regards written sources, is dependent, though not exclusively so, on Herodotus. Dr. Jones will broaden this picture by presenting the results of the survey work he has conducted to date. So, without any further ado, I turn the metaphorical lectern over to him so he can deliver his lecture, The Plataea Survey, Update on Archaeological Fieldwork. Robert, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen. Let's see if, can you see that okay? Okay. All right,
yes,
so good evening. My name is Robert Jones. I really appreciate the invitation. It was nearly 5 years ago when we first met. I met Director Paspoulos in a coordinated attempt to approach the Greek government with the Plataea project. My portion of the project essentially began in 2013. My supervisor at the time was a student of William Kendrick Pritchett at the University of California. Professor Pritchett likely spent more time on the actual battlefield at Plataea than any researcher in history. Over the course of many seasons, he cataloged and theorized his findings in numerous publications. My supervisor at the time, for reasons unknown to me, perhaps even cynical, suggested that I research and see what I come up with the battle. And so I began the long process of head spinning. Simply put, the Battle of Plataea is a mess. The primary sources are vague, and the markers used to identify the locations have long since vanished from the field, leading to widespread, sometimes even outlandish conjectures as to what happened and where it took place. In early 2014, I visited the site to see kind of what I could decipher myself after reading all of these sources. I walked to some of what I thought was the battlefield, and I began looking at the topography in comparison to what I had read. I began coming up with some theories of my own based on what I saw. And we don't know much for sure about the Battle of Plataea, but a few quick notes, and I won't get too far into detail on these kind of items, but the battle is the centerpiece of Book 9 of Herodotus's Histories. Fought in 479 BCE between the invading Persian army under the command of the capable general Mardonius against an allied Greek army under the command of the Spartan Pausanias. The battle was a decisive Greek victory, one that expelled the Persians from Greek soil. It was also the largest land battle of the Greco-Persian Wars and the last battle fought on Greek soil. So you can see some of the maps I came up with. This was 8 years ago. I created about 20 different maps of decently well thought out theories based on what I'd read in Herodotus himself. I added troop numbers, formations, and even some tactics. But at the end of my master's program, I still felt rather hollow. I knew that there was no way of truly learning anything about this battle and concrete event without extensive on-site research. And so I began the process of further legitimizing the project. Over the next 2 years, I searched all over the world for a potential PhD supervisor to take on my project. And in 2016, I finally enrolled at the University of Newcastle under the guidance of Dr. Elizabeth Bainham. I spent the next year working to confirm the project through internal channels at the university. And in the summer of 2017, I gained that confirmation. After that, I was directed toward the AAIA, where Dr. Paspoulos and myself met and began the year-long process of submitting applications to the Greek government. The entire project was actually funded and organized without a fieldwork permit. And it was up until about 2 weeks that we were due to leave for Greece that we finally were issued our permit. And so there was a little bit of stress and anxiety involved in that process. We finally obtained our permit and we were due to leave. In the end, myself, the AAIA, and Professor Kennedy, who acted as a senior field archaeologist for the project, along with the Ephrates of West Attica and Boeotia, collaborated on the understanding of a non-invasive survey of the landscape near the battlefield. So we purchased these topo maps. They're kind of decently hard to follow from the Hellenic Geographic Military Service. And we planned a three-pronged attack for our field work. First, there was UAV mapping to be performed by myself or the AAIA team, as well as geophysics to be performed by our AAIA team. Surface surveys were going to be conducted by the team from the West Attica Ephrat. So this is the current landscape at the battlefield of Plataea. A few notes about the area. It is huge, some 10 square kilometers, maybe even larger of potential battle site. And so you have this massive, massive area that's almost entirely comprised of farmland and heavily worked with modern equipment. Although the battle is called the Battle of Plataea, it was not actually fought near the ancient town of Plataea over here. It was probably fought in this area right here in front of modern Erythraeus or Cryopouki. The water is also almost completely dried up in the area, which makes everything much more difficult to follow with our historic records. There's a modern aqueduct that's south of the Esopus River, and it takes pretty much all of the water in the area. And so I will get a little bit into some of what we were looking for. Our most in-depth source, as has been mentioned, is Herodotus. His description of the battle has been analyzed or scrutinized heavily. Most notably, he was not there. He was relying on secondary sources and tertiary sources that were actually at the battlefield. And very few of his geographical markers that he mentions are actually still commonplace. Some things that were obviously very familiar with people 2,500 years ago are not actually on the surface today. And so the battle and the relevant information thereof was presented in Book 9 of Histories. And there's roughly 11 different markers that Herodotus mentions with various degrees of relevancy. You have the initial deployment markers, Erythrae, Hysae, 2 towns, as well as Skolos, another town, the Esopus River, which is there today, and then a Persian encampment, which was supposed to be near the town of Skolos. During the battle deployment phase, there is the Gargaphia Spring, which is scrutinized in the present time. It's not very clear, but I think we have a good idea of some of the potential locations for the spring. And then the precinct of the hero Androcrates, which is also heavily scrutinized. The movement, there is this island, this mysterious island, of varying degrees of relevancy too. It's not super relevant to the battle itself, and so I didn't really concentrate on it much. And then you have the Temple of Hera at Plataea, that we have a decent idea about where that location is. And then in the final battle, you have 3 basic sites: the Moloes River, Argiopion, where there was a temple of Demeter. So I wanted to concentrate on 6 of the 11 markers, which constitute 3 primary spots on the field: Argiopion and the Temple of Demeter, along with the Moloais River, where the battle was actually fought. Androcrates and the Gargafia Spring, where the Greeks were deployed and began taking heavy Persian arrow fire. And Skolos and the Persian fortification, a spot that was meant to hold so many thousands and thousands of Persian troops. And so here's some of the historical locations. So this is the Gargafia Spring from the Temple of Demeter, and it kind of gives you an idea of how far away they are from the temple of these potential locations. I think the 2 primary locations that people really analyze are this one right here to the south of St. John Church, as well as this one to the kind of in between St. Demetrios and St. John. And then you have the historic locations for the precinct of Androcrates. People have put this precinct both with the modern churches as well as a few other locations. And we'll get into that a little bit further here. And then the historical locations for Argiopion and the Temple of Demeter. So here's the present. I won't get into a full recap of site selection. That would take an entire lecture in itself. I'm going to be decently brief on this. We are limited as far as our scope in exploratory geophysics, which is essentially what we were doing in 2018. Using geophysics as a tool not to discover exactly what is beneath the surface, but to establish that there is something beneath the surface that's worth looking into. The primary idea was to use our history and the landscape to our advantage. So from our site visit in 2014 to kind of narrow down the geographical advantages that the land had to offer, and then go to those spots to search for things. We could organize our potential sites then from most likely to least likely to produce something relevant to the battle. And so this means we really concentrated heavily on modern churches near the battlefield where we're going to do geophysics. Humans have the propensity to build over and on top of and replace religious sites and basically kind of replacing them with the new order of things. And so we really wanted to concentrate on those areas. In the field, this meant the modern churches of St. Demetrios and St. John were given geophysical priorities for the site on the battlefield. And both are kind of strategically important parts of the landscape, as you'll see here in a little bit with some of the mapping that we have done. And both are seemingly within the relevant battlefield parameters mentioned in history. The Church of St. George to the east and across the Esopus River was the 3rd major candidate for geophysics. It's actually in the jurisdiction of the Ephorate of Boeotia. And so that's why the project was a collaboration between the 2 Ephorates. And the area is also close to Pausanias's description of the town of Skolos. And this is Pausanias, the travel writer and geographer, not the general, the Spartan general from the Battle of Plataea. And then we were going to work at St. Anna and St. Inauguri to the south. This is mainly due to some of the local stories of the potential grave of Mardonius in the area. And so we kind of took a little bit of a foray into that area as well as the Pantanassa Ridge, as you see to the east of modern day Erythrace or Craipugi. All right, so there's quite a few slides of mapping, and I won't go too crazy into it. This was a huge part of the 2018 field work, but I'll kind of explain some of the slides as they come up. So this is all that we mapped in the area. In total, we mapped about 5,000 acres of the battlefield in the 2 weeks. My goal was to obtain as much breadth as possible and to really work on illustrating the depth of the land to the potential reader or viewer that might not have the opportunity to visit the battlefield. So we had a really good idea of what we wanted to map prior to the arrival on site. This is a grid that I created. I had 10 drone batteries that I would charge each day before going to the site, and then just trying to go through the grid and fill in as much of the land as I could, starting kind of with the middle of the proposed battlefield and then working my way to the outside perimeter and just getting as much as I could possibly do within the day on site where it wasn't either super windy or raining or something like that. And so we had about, of the 14 days on site, we probably had 9 good days of drone mapping and surface surveys. So if you have any interest in some of these maps that I'll share, I do have quite a few more that I have in this presentation. Satellite imagery is great, but you don't get quite the detail you get with the drone mapping. This is the area next to the modern Church of St. George in Boeotia. And then here is the primary battlefield. And you can kind of see, you watch my mouse clicker, here's the modern St. Demetrios Church tree clump. Here is the St. John. This is modern Erythrace right over here. And this is ancient Plataea over here. And so you can kind of see that the battlefield's not really even near the town of Plataea. Another one of the really main features I wanted to get across with my mapping was elevation, and to show how high these sites are in comparison to the rest of the land. So when Herodotus says on the hills and then deployed to the low-lying land on the site, he really means this ridge system here would be the hills, and then the lowland kind of going across to the west near the Asopus River and in front of the town of Plataea. And so really illustrating how tall or how elevated these areas are was really important to me with the drone mapping. And so I also was able to get some shading involved with the mapping as well, and that really shows the ridge systems, as you can see with the shade, especially right here and right here. Another thing that I was able to do was to show the ancient waterways that would have been relevant in Herodotus's time, something that he could reference that really isn't appropriate today. We have, they're more like creeks and small tributaries, not these rivers that Herodotus mentioned. Even the Asopus River is quite small. It's only about a meter wide in some areas. And so really what he saw, or what the people at the Battle of Plataea saw so many years ago, is just so much different than the modern landscape. We were able to also illustrate quite a few features in the land with drone mapping that you can't really see on satellite. Satellite's pretty good to show features in the land, but the drone is so much higher resolution. And so I was able to kind of go after 2018, and when I was done processing the imagery, I would see some of the items that we would concentrate on for the next year. And so if there's something that I saw, like either a stone wall or something like that that was in a feature, I would just mark it and be ready for it for the next year's surface surveys. And you can kind of see this is kind of an Ottoman ruin that I marked as potential features that we went back to in 2019. So with the geophysics, in 2018, we used 2 types of geophysics. First and foremost, we used ground penetrating radar and conducted in-depth surveys at St. Demetrios, St. John, and St. George. Then we conducted magnetometer surveys at St. Demetrios, St. Anna, and St. Onagri. At St. Demetrios, these were decently successful. At both St. Anna and Onagri, they're kind of fruitless endeavors, far too many disturbances to really see anything with a magnetometer. The geophysics in itself was extremely promising at our 2 primary priority locations within the battlefield. And honestly, we got exactly what we were hoping for, which was a legitimate reason to go forward. At St. Demetrios, this was particularly promising with the anomalies we saw here, labeled number 2, as well as number 4. And then this area, number 5, likely deeply buried metal objects, was also very interesting. Here's some of the reflections, and I won't get too in-depth on this, but I thought it was relevant to see some of these scarring patterns from the geophysics after they were analyzed. And you'll see some of the very small hyperbola here at the other spot at St. Demetrios. At St. John, honestly, the geophysics is probably even more exciting than St. Demetrios. There's just so much, so many anomalies in the subsurface reflections. And so we are very excited about eventually going back to this area to excavate some. But we wanted to concentrate on some of the other areas first. Again, here's some of the reflection pattern. You can see the planar scarring in the land here, and at some decent depths too. Not only is there surface disturbances, but the depth of the disturbances go pretty deep into the land. At St. George, we didn't come up with too much in terms of geophysics. At this spot right here where my mouse is, we did have some decent activity, but nothing to really warrant further exploration. There just wasn't much there, and there's kind of signs of heavy scarring from the machinery used to build the modern church, and I think that was the main part of the geophysics that we noted. So really nothing that we were too keen on returning. The magnetometer at St. Demetrios, and you can kind of see the magnetic low here. This is a giant rebar enforced bench. But this magnetic low here is actually something that was pretty relevant in the geophysics. And so the magnetometer worked decently well at this location, but most of the magnetometer results were not what we were hoping for. It's just the soil, whether or not it's just too magnetic, or it just didn't really produce the results we were looking for. And that was truly the case at St. Anna, where there's really no disturbances, really no anomalies. And then in St. Inauguri, where there was far too many disturbances in the magnetometer readings. A lot of that was due to there's heavy amounts of shotgun shells around the church, and so there's just hits everywhere, and so you really don't get a good grasp of what's underneath the surface with those. During the surface surveys, we scoured the surface in 2018 of the battlefield in search of any remnants of the battle. Unfortunately, almost the entire battlefield has been heavily farmed and turned under by plows and heavy machinery for years. This being said, there's still quite a bit to find on the surface, whether there's shards of ceramic, or in some of the cases we found slinger stones that were really the only military items of military significance that we were able to find. In total, we found 5 slinger stones, 2 of which were close to the primary battlefield in between the churches of St. John and St. Demetrios. And so here's one of the slinger stones that I found actually personally walking and doing the drone mapping. When you're mapping the whole area, you have a lot of time to kind of search the ground and see if you can come up with different items. And so you really spend a lot of time staring at the ground while your drone is up in the air doing its thing. And here is a different one that was on the eastern side of St. Demetrios Church. And apologize for this blurry image. So this is at the Pantanassa Ridge, where we found this potential temple, which is a rather neat find. And you can kind of see it with the drone imagery. The drone was getting just crazily disturbed with these power lines at this point. And so a lot of my images at this juncture are a little bit blurry. And so that was kind of frustrating when I went back to process the imagery. But here's a little bit clearer view of some of the little possibly offering pieces of ceramic and beads that we found, and this potential kind of offering hole at this potential temple. Here's some of our people from the West Attica Ephora searching the base of the potential temple. Also, here's a good show of the giant power lines that were wreaking havoc on my drone at that point. It's also one of the more windy days, which wind definitely plays a factor in the drone work. But here's a Roman coin we found at the Church of Pantanessa, as well as some examples of the shards that we found. And you can kind of see the ancient fabric wall system that's prevalent in the area. Here is the Church of St. George to the north of the Asopus River. During the surface surveys, this is one of the heavier hit areas. There's just so many shards in this field that's to the direct south of the church. This is the Asopus River right here. As you can see, it's more of the Asopus Creek at this point, but we have lots and lots of activity of just ceramic shards that were in this field as well as this field right here that could certainly be items that we use for further exploration in the future for the potential of the town of Skolos, which is kind of what we're looking for with this area, but nothing concrete, nothing even super classical era as far as the shards go. All right, so what did all this mean? So in 2018, we kind of met our goal. Our entire goal was to have a reason to come back. And in this, we accomplished more than enough to warrant further exploration. In fact, 2018 was extremely successful in this regard. And a few months later, after our fieldwork had commenced, the Greek government approved an additional 3 weeks of fieldwork to begin in 2019. The plan in 2019 was to spend another full week on surface surveys, which would include more mapping and geophysics, and then 2 weeks in excavation at the modern St. Demetrios church, where again, we're looking at our goals, and just like before with the exploratory geophysics, to go on site and figure out what the most likely return on our investment would be. And so going to the middle of the battlefield and working our way out seemed like the best plan as far as our actual excavation. But we also concentrated on the first week in 2019 kind of to scour the area on more surface surveys. And we started, and this is high above, this is actually an image of Pantanessa Ridge, where that potential temple was. The temple is kind of up in, our potential temple is kind of up in this area up here. This is the actual church where that coin was found. But in this area, we're looking east from Pritchett's well. During his surface surveys in the mid-20th century, he mentions an inscription found indicating a temple of Demeter, which has since been moved from the area, and I believe it's at a museum, but I don't know where that inscription is. And so I gathered some drone imagery of the well for mapping purposes, while the Greek team began their surface survey to the south of the well. And so this is a look to the east from the well. This is a look towards modern Erythrace or Cryokouki to the west of the well. And then here is the well itself. You can kind of see some of the ceramic shards that are left over at the well. And one of the stories the locals had of this well was that people were actually buried in this well during World War II. And so that's one of the interesting items of note from local history, which local history plays a good part of our surface surveys. This is the Greek team doing their surface survey to the south of the well and potential temple area that we were searching for. And then this wall of ancient fabric, which was very interesting. So we began our minor excavation near this wall system to the south of the well, where we found many classical era shards. The base of the wall unveiled quite a bit of ceramic material. You can see as we dug down, the base of the wall had all of this ceramic, and it pretty much goes along the entire wall. And so this area will probably lead to further excavation in the future to do a little bit more in depth and not just a quick probe down into the base of the wall. So based on a lot of the surface materials, and in addition to Pritchett's findings of the inscription to Demeter in this area, it seems likely that a temple, whether or not it's our temple to Demeter, is definitely up for debate, but it seems likely that Argiopion could be searched for in this area. And I'm not sure if there's enough material at this point to confirm a location or anything like that, but it's definitely worth looking into. This is a screenshot from my phone, so you can get an idea of where this area is in respect to the modern Erythrace right here. And then if you move a bit north towards right in this area, and you have a little distance from the potential Gargafia spring, it's roughly 2 kilometers away, which would be close to 10 stays of what Herodotus says. And obviously we take all these measurements from Herodotus with a grain of salt, but at least we do have some items that do match the history with in respect to these locations, and a potential Greek deployment at the Gargafia Spring, and then the redeployment before the battle to the river Moloes and the town of Argiopion. Right now, there is some flow in this small stream, but certainly not what I would call a river that he referenced in Moloes. The land must have looked dramatically different 2,500 years ago. So moving west with our surface surveys in 2019, we did notice in the drone imagery quite a few of these walls to the west, kind of in between the Pantanassa Ridge and Erythrace. And so I mapped this area, and we spent half a day or so marching around the area. There's some hills there prior to reaching a small valley before Mount Kithaeron. There wasn't much in terms of classical material or even ceramic shards or anything found, but the wall systems were certainly very old. Back into the east, this is a kind of oblong slinger stone found at the Church of St. George. This is not the original Church of St. George. This is a different Church of St. George near modern Daphne. We had some luck moving east, like with this slinger stone, and so we used a few days to survey some of the different spots in the area. And you can kind of see the modern church here, and this is the location where there's some more classical era walls, and so we concentrated a little bit on it. Didn't come up with too much though, but we scoured this area as well as this Church of Saint Marina in a similar area, and basically just from the road you can see stone walls in this hill, and so we got out and took a look for around a half day or so. And then moving to the north and into the potential battlefield, this was close to an Ottoman ruin, this Church of Zeudokus, and it was worth having another surface survey. Again, didn't find much in terms of that surface survey as well. Other than the stone at St. George, we didn't come up with much at these locations, which was again, kind of expected with how heavily this area has been gone over with equipment. This is the Church of St. Anna from the year before when we did the magnetometer. We went back in 2019 to conduct more GPR on this area based on a lot of the kind of local stories. You see this cave. This is actually a neat mythological cave, you might say. It's called the Cave of Actaeon, from the myth of Actaeon and Artemis, where Actaeon was caught watching Artemis bathe in the Gargathia spring. Artemis was outraged and turned Actaeon into a deer so that his own dogs would hunt him. And so if you are familiar with that story, this is a cave that the locals say is Actaeon's cave. The GPR at St. Anna actually went quite well. The direct east of the church as well as the north of the church possibly warrant further excavation. There's quite a few anomalies that we saw, some pretty heavy hyperbola in the reflections. But that takes us to our primary goal with our 2019 fieldwork, which was St. Demetrios. This is not to be confused with the Temple of Demeter with a similar name, which has certainly confused a lot of the scholars of the past. But St. Demetrios is a modern church, some kind of maybe a Byzantine style modern church, built probably in the late 19th or early 20th century. So it's not an old church, but it is relevant as far as its location and the prominence of that location. The beautiful grove, which encompasses the church, is a grove mentioned probably by Plutarch in his reference to his shrine of the hero Androcrates. I've always found this compelling, not because Plutarch has been labeled as a reliable source for the battle itself, which he is not, but because Plutarch was Boeotian and possibly even a contemporary of the shrine of Androcrates. And so I thought we could put some stock into that, even though Plutarch was around about 500 years after Herodotus's story, which is certainly long enough for the shrine to not be there anymore. But his description of the shrine and its placement at probably this location hasn't been given enough credit in my opinion. So many scholars have discounted almost everything Plutarch has said based on other legitimate errors in his telling, but I don't think it's very wise in this particular instance when this is certainly a potential location for that shrine. So outside of some of the material within the church itself, you can kind of see this marble piece that was built into the mortar of the church. And this is certainly older marble that you can infer that it might have been taken from the ground, but it's hard to know that for sure. And so we don't really know where this marble came from, but it is older and built within the walls. There's a few of these pieces in the church itself. And there's also these large columns or column. This is down toward the south of the church, but it's been modified with modern rebar. And so some of the locals have mentioned that there was another column toward the northeast of the church in the early 20th century. And they said that there's two columns that acted and kind of stood like a gateway with each other, but there's no evidence of that now. And so alas, at this point in time, there's so much heavy traffic and trash from modern times that most of the classical material is just gone from the area. But we began our excavation to the direct east of the church, if you remember point 4 from the GPR image at St. Demetrios earlier. And we picked up quite a large amount of activity in this area. And so we thought this would be a great place to probe. We were expecting to find some kind of a wall or something like that, or other similar construction. So we measured out an area roughly 2.5 meters by 6 meters to the direct top of our GPR activity. And you can kind of see here on the reflection that I took of the year right before we dug, quite a lot of disturbance here in the GPR. And so this is the area, this is the church. And so this is the area right about here that we kind of carved out to begin our digging. So we hit a significant amount of rocks almost immediately, as well as tree roots. It's kind of a theme in 2019. If we could hit it, we did hit it. And so quite a lot of delays, even at the beginning of our excavations. To the northeast, most side of the dig, we finally hit something, and that was a ceramic gravestone. We hit 2 more ceramic spots, and so we knew we were getting to an excavation where we had human remains. And honestly, this was a bit frustrating because we knew how much care we would be taking removing these skeletons, and basically the breadth of our dig had just taken a pretty massive hit. And so as opposed to maybe probing down and getting to 4 or 5 different sites at St. Demetrios, we were looking at 1 or 2 sites based on our human remains that we found. So our initial plan had us digging quite a few more spots. Instead, we were kind of lucky to get with even what we were seeing finished. So alas, we moved forward. We knew immediately that the burials predated the church, which is a good thing. You can kind of see these ceramic plates that were placed on them, maybe Roman or late Roman, maybe early Byzantine. Don't know for sure because we didn't find many classical era or any kind of other than the gravestones themselves. There wasn't much in the graves. We noticed the stones going alongside. So this is probably what wreaked havoc on the GPR, where we saw bedrock and walls. Basically, the graves were cut into the stones for the separate graves. And so that's probably what made it look like a wall in the GPR imagery. That's why GPR is a wonderful tool for exploration, but as far as identifying objects, it is not a very good tool at this point. So we initially thought the grave over on this side to the northeast part of the excavation was a mass grave. But it turns out that they're actually skeletons, one holding another one. We didn't know that at first, but it's either a mother holding a child or a husband holding a small wife or something of that nature. The middle grave was a small child. We do know that right here. And you kind of see in the bedrock where this was carved out. It was actually kind of carved out in a U for this small child. The far grave over here was female. We do know that from some small pieces of jewelry that we found. It was really the only items we found with the skeletons other than the skeletons themselves. There are poor graves outside of the bronze jewelry. We did, which is here. Looks like a diadem or kind of a tiara, and then a bracelet out of bronze. And so they were very, nothing of note as far as there's nothing elaborate or anything like that besides these. We reached the bedrock in 6 days after taking quite a bit of care and removing the skeletons and coming up with a plan as far as what we want to do is carbon dating. We did take some teeth for that purpose. Unfortunately, COVID kind of screwed that up. And so now 3 years later, we're still waiting on our carbon dating results. But while we were finishing up this excavation and removing the skeletons, I rescanned the area in front of the church to the direct north of the Church of St. Demetrios with my GPR and was really excited about what I had come up with. These giant hyperbola in the reflections are just wonderful to look at as far as GPR imagery. You know you're going to go down and find something when you dig with activity like that. And so I was very excited about that. And we only had a short amount of time left on site. And so I carved out this little spot of about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters that we could just kind of probe down, see if we could add to our the depth of our excavation this year when we had run out of so much time. And so the scan kind of reinforced what I was thinking the year before with this. And so sure enough, we hit another grave almost immediately. It was about 1 meter down, maybe a little bit less than 1 meter down. And what's interesting about this grave is that there's basically all these different stone pieces, which is what I hit on the GPR, directly over the skull of the skeleton. And so where I got that really neat hyperbola is basically because of this stone where the head was placed on a piece of bedrock, and then there's a little stone kind of pyramid above the skull. And so it's another rather unfortunate because we knew this was it for the year. Just like before, we do know that this is a massive cemetery. At this point, there's signs of a grave to the north. There's signs of more graves going directly toward the church. The church is likely built directly on top of a very large cemetery. The skeletons in the burials to the east of the church also had many more skeletons around that probably just weren't built into bedrock. And so the GPR isn't going to pick up much as far as organic remains. And so what we did pick up was the bedrock, or something like this, where it's a giant piece of stone kind of sticking out, where it kind of looks like a piece of a building or something like that, where in fact it was bedrock, skull, and these stones that were around it. One of the neater items when we removed the skeleton was a strange hole carved underneath the body and into the bedrock. And actually, we didn't have time to further explore, but it actually shoots down through toward the church. And so it might warrant some further excavation. For what we could reach, we certainly didn't find anything. So if it was some kind of offering hole underneath the body, the items has since been removed, or that's just not what it was for, and it's just some kind of random spot in the bedrock. But it does appear that the modern church was built directly over the cemetery. It does also, it will be very interesting to see. We're excited about the skeletons and what they produce as far as the carbon dating, but with the delays, it's been rather frustrating. We really want to see if the skeletons predate the modern town of Erythrace or Craicuki. Basically, we want to see if this site had religious significance before the modern town was built, and to see if we can predate the town a little bit and show that it was being used for significant religious activities prior to the modern era. And so we've sent those teeth in and we are waiting. So our next locations, again, I went back through and did quite a lot of scanning to add depth to the GPR results. This was an area where we are going to concentrate on our next dig. Hopefully this July, we're going to go back on site, but we're still up in the air. Likely, know within a month of actually returning to the site. But this area right here is certainly interesting, deeply buried metal objects. It was not something we could get into after we hit the first grave site. We knew right away that we had to cut our losses as much as possible and just do a smaller excavation. But we do have plans to bring more teams out, more work men to come out and actually dig more sites, perhaps having 3 teams as opposed to 1 team that we had this time. And then we can do our further excavations at St. Demetrios and then go to St. John and hopefully St. Anna as well this year. And so that's basically where we are with the research. It's interesting to say the least. Nothing super definitive, but it certainly adds to the depth of our knowledge of the battlefield of Plataea. We certainly know more now than we did in 2018 when we started. And so I'm certainly happy to take any questions that people might have. I can kind of go into here to see, I haven't looked to see if there's any chat room activity. But I can stop sharing my screen now and open it up to see if anybody has anything to ask or go from there.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for that very enticing and for that exposition of a very enticing and promising work. And I'm sure we all look forward to hearing what results come up from your work that we all hope you will conduct in July and thereafter, indeed.
For sure. For sure.
I was just wondering, I was intrigued by, I think it was on the Pantanasa Ridge where you identified an area as possible a ritual site and you showed a handful of finds and whatnot. Was there any architecture that was found there, or was it, or to date at least, only indicated by a natural rock outcrop?
It looked like the natural rock outcrop. Other than the beading and those kind of things that we found, they were kind of found in that hole. But yeah, nothing really definitive. The hole itself looked like it was carved out by humans. But other than that, there's really nothing there's no inscriptions, there's no evidence. It's more of just a potential, it's alluring more than anything. It's nothing definitive.
Yeah, well, lovely, thank you. And okay, there are 2 ways to ask questions. Either you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you prefer, you could write it into the chat and I'll